On today's special midweek episode, we'll talk analytics, health, some baseball stories, and more. Former Major League pitcher and current director of pitching of the San Francisco Giants, Brian Bannister, joins us next on Beat the Shift. Welcome to another episode of the Beat the Shift podcast presented by Fangraphs. I am your host, Ariel Cohen, and with me as always is Ruvain Guy. How are you, Ruvain?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, and we've got a great show for you tonight. We have a former major leaguer who pitched 5 major league years with both the Mets and the Kansas City Royals. His best year in 2007, he had a 3.87 ERA, accumulating a 2.3 WAR in that time. He also has coached for both the Boston Red Sox and currently with the San Francisco Giants. Please welcome to the show, Brian Bannister. How are you, Brian?
Doing well. Great to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on the show. Our pleasure for having you. And just before we start, what would you say has been the highlight of your career so far?
The obvious answer is winning the World Series in 2018. That was the culmination of a lot of work and failure as both a player and a coach. And to just do that in a team environment and stand up on the stage at Dodger Stadium and hold that trophy up with your friends and front office mates, it was pretty incredible. And so that was definitely the highlight.
Yeah. What was your highlight of your playing career as well?
My favorite story is in my favorite game ever. My favorite highlight, I lost, and it was pitching at Fenway Park. If you get into the 8th inning as a visiting pitcher, whether you like the song or not, Sweet Caroline comes on as you're warming up for the inning. And it's a pretty special thing to still be out there against the Red Sox at Fenway. The music's playing. The fans are going nuts. I gave up a double off the wall to Dustin Pedroia and lost, but I went 8 shutout up to that point, and that was my favorite game I ever pitched in. So that is still the little boy inside of me. I loved pitching in that game and just being out there until the end of the game. And so that was my personal highlight, even though I lost.
Wow. And since Ruben and I are Met fans, do you have a favorite Mets moment?
That team in 2006 that I was on was incredible. We should have won the World Series.
Yeah.
To be around Pedro and Glavine, to be around so many all-stars, guys that had tremendous careers. We won the division. The Endy Chavez catch that year. Even though we lost, it was such a tremendous team. And, my catch partner was Chad Bradford, the submariner from Moneyball fame. And there are a lot of guys that took me under the wing that year. And I just enjoyed the team and everything about the city that year.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. I cannot remember Shea Stadium shaking more than it did during Game 6 of the NLCS. I was at that game. It was absolutely incredible to see. I was in, I think, the Loge level, and just the whole stadium shook above, and you thought it was going to crash down. It was an incredible scene.
Yeah, I'm such a big fan of all those guys, and it was just a privilege to be on that team that year.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, well, and it's time for the Injury Gurus Trivia of the Week.
Well, you mentioned a little bit about your playing career, playing with the Mets, playing with the Royals. I want to see if you know or you can remember these people. Name the 2 Hall of Famers that you played with. First question.
Glavine and Pedro on the 06 team.
Yep, you were 100% correct. Those are the 2 Hall of Famers that you played with. But now this is a little bit of a tougher question. Can you name 5 players who are still in the MLB? They're still playing, and you played with them. I'll give you a hint. 4 of them are pitchers.
Yeah, Greinke's still out there.
That's one.
Casimir I played with. We had him this past year. He was my teammate in Port St. Lucie with the Mets. Yusmeiro Petit, Joaquim Soria was still around this past year. I'm trying to think who else. Anybody that's still playing has had a tremendous career.
Well, not 100% true, but Gerard Dyson, he's still playing. Jesse Chavez, he's still playing. You played with him in Kansas City.
Jesse's
And
done very well for himself.
And of course, I have to save this for last, but Oliver Perez.
Oh wow.
Oliver Perez, he's still playing. He's still pitching. Based on this, you've had a long career. Based on major and baseball, you're still considered 5 years, still considered a long career. But you played in college also. Talk about the impact that you had on your college team.
I had a couple scholarship offers to other small schools, and I'm a big photography, cinema nut. And so I went to SC with the ill intentions of also being in the film school, and had to walk on at SC. I got an art scholarship. So I wasn't one of the main guys, but I still think the reason I got seen was by my sophomore year. I got to be the closer on the team behind Mark Fryer, who was the number 2 overall pick. So the scouts were all there to see Mark, and I was kind of the mop-up guy that would come in after him. So I got seen a little bit that year and played on some good teams in a good program. But just privileged to go to the College World Series my first 2 years. And my senior year, got to be one of the main starters on the team and get drafted by the Mets. So that was a real privilege.
So this is the Fangraphs podcast, so I definitely have to talk about analytics. And, in your current role, you're the Giants director of pitching, and you do things like predictive analytics, machine learning, pitch design, 3D motion capture, biochemical modeling, visual cognitive deception. Oh my goodness, that's quite a lot of stuff. And clearly you're a big proponent of analytics. Can you explain what some of these terms are, some of these things that you use to help others in terms of analytics, and what your impact is now on your current Giants team?
I wish I was much better at coding than I am and building models. My way of approaching the game from an analytical perspective is to kind of build mental models on what I know is happening, even though I can't quite explain it. I'm not the guy that can actually quantify it with the code, with the math, but I'm always hunting around the ideas. And so a lot of my original ideas that I kind of came up with a decade plus ago have held true until now, even though at the time I couldn't quantify it, either because the technology wasn't out at the time. We started with QuestTech in 2002, PitchFX 2007, TrackMan 2012, and Hawkeye now. But when I was kind of trying to figure out some of these things, just sitting in my garage at home, this was even pre-TrackMan, so we didn't have spin rate, we didn't have extension. I kind of had to sketch out a lot of these concepts and rough them out in my head. But some of them have held up for the last decade on what I came up with back then. And it's been fun to work with people much more talented than me to actually quantify them over the years. But a lot of the competitive advantages that I developed a long time ago have still served me well throughout all these years. And now that we have Hawkeye, we can quantify a lot more things than we used to. But for a while, we just didn't have the technology to fully quantify exactly what was happening. But they still represented competitive advantages because we had mental models kind of built around a lot of these concepts.
And that speaks to your resourcefulness and as well as your intuition. I mean, a lot of things you were saying, you've surmised, and then you're now able to quantify it. And kudos to you for knowing the right direction to take everything. Question for you in terms of bang for the buck, because obviously there's a lot of tools at your disposal. What would you say is the most important or the most effective tool that you've used, or maybe what analytics stat family or something like that would have given you the best bang for the buck in terms of usefulness over your career here?
I'm a big believer that you don't just run one big model on all pitchers, that there's different ways and there's different styles for pitchers to get batters out. And, whether you want to call it buckets, et cetera, I'm just a big believer in studying the uniqueness of pitchers. If 10 men walk into a suit store the same suit off the rack doesn't fit all 10. And I just love studying the greats and the outliers in the game and figuring out what makes them so unique, and then breaking it down further from there. So a lot of it is just putting in the time to study why some pitchers are so much better than all the other ones, and then reverse engineering that into something that I can then share with younger pitchers or pitchers that we acquire. And that it's the process, because people learn in different ways. Some are visual learners, some are audio learners, kinesthetic learners. And a lot of people learn better by hearing things through a story or an analogy rather than hearing the raw data itself. So I attribute a lot of, just the overall success over the years to just the ability to present the analytics in a format that specific player can digest and tailor it specifically for what he needs to do to get major league hitters out who are the best in the world. So however you want to define that process, I'm a big believer in the process over just the power of the raw numbers themselves, even though I incorporate that into everything I do.
Have you found that certain organizations are either ahead of the analytics or behind in the analytics or just on par?
Yeah, for sure. And I've had the privilege of working with people that have been part of the inner circle of pitching at the major league level. Houston, when Sig was over there, Mike Fast. You see what Cleveland's done over the years, Tampa. There's certain organizations that were ahead of everybody else. And I was fortunate to get exposure to people that had learned from really talented people in those organizations, and kind of compiled all that information along with my own self-discoveries. So I'm definitely a compilation of a lot of talented people and concepts, and continue to make new discoveries all the time. But I attribute a lot of my success to being willing to learn from other organizations and study what they're doing, the types of pitchers they're acquiring, how they're developing them, and then studying the great pitchers in those organizations and what makes them so great.
Got a mailbag question from Michael, and he asks, hey, Brian, can you give some insight into what teams might be looking at that fans don't have publicly available? There's a lot of bright people working on things like VAA, seam-shifted wake, and other ERA estimators. So, Brian, is there anything else that you can tell us about maybe what's coming in terms of the next step of analytics, or maybe what we can see on the horizon?
I think some of the most valuable things have always been the things that aren't explicitly told through the data, the things that have to be inferred, the things that are derivatives of the data. I remember sketching out my first VAA model back in 2011, and it's something that I've refined for the last decade. I always believed in seam shifted wake, just for the simple fact that when you throw a knuckleball with no spin on it, it still moves like crazy. So I knew something was impacting the baseball when there's no Magnus forces on the baseball. And so I always knew it existed. And you watch Greg Maddux throw, front door hip shot two seamers, and you're like, how did the ball move like that? I just knew there were other things happening. And as I got more exposure to pitchers that could leverage those concepts, like Rick Porcello in 2016 winning the Cy Young, and seeing a lot of it up close, working with Stephen Wright, who was an all-star knuckleballer, working with the submarine pitchers, I've just slowly added skills to my skill set by working with these pitchers and kind of learning and absorbing what they do so special. And I think that's the fun part is, you might not find it on Baseball Savant, or you might not see it on Brooks Baseball, but there's just things that you can kind of model in your head. They're happening, even though there's no way to prove it. But then that's where it gets fun to dive in with pitchers and try and figure it out.
Yeah. I was just listening to Alex Chamberlain, one of our other writers over at Fangraphs, and he was talking about, a lot of it has to do with the attack angle and whether you're throwing high or low fastballs. And he pointed to Paul Sewald, who has the straightest fastball in baseball currently, and he has one of the lower release points, and the fastball seems to almost move slightly upward. And Sewald struck out over 100 batters in relief work this year. I mean, have you seen things like this happen?
You know, if you look back, I study baseball history constantly. You just look back in any great photo of like Tom Seaver throwing, Nolan Ryan throwing. You know, there's just things those guys did that are different. I think one of the reasons pitchers are good is that they present something unusual and different to hitters, whether their body is unique. You know, there's some attributes about them that are outlier. That it's been that way throughout baseball history, and that's what I find so fascinating. You know, Koufax's high arm slot, Mariano's rising cut fastball. There's just things that some pitchers do that nobody else can do. So I'm always searching for attributes that represent something different from the crowd, just because it's hard for hitters to predict the path of the baseball when they have no way to practice that type of pitch and they've never seen it before. It's just hard to get into the batter's box under pressure in a game and make solid contact with a pitch they've never seen before.
Now, we know of the Astros scandal that they were using technology to steal signs, relaying the information in real time to win games. But there isn't anything wrong in studying and preparing for your opponent in advance. And of course, figuring out sequences during the game the old-fashioned way or watching video. How much of analytics do you use to help your teammates or your the players on your team play to their strengths and also figure out how to exploit the other team's weaknesses?
I think a big part of preparing the modern day pitcher to go out and compete is just letting them get comfortable with what their own personal analytics are, knowing their body, because ultimately you can't coach them on every pitch. They have to make the adjustments themselves. But when they're so fluent in their own numbers, their own analytical concepts that lead to their success on the field, and you build up that culture, in Boston, we started off having to educate all the pitchers on all their numbers. But then by the time we won the World Series in 2018, all the pitchers knew their numbers. They knew what they needed to do out there. And, they would ask me questions. And once you get the culture to that point where the pitchers are craving the information as fast as you can give it to them, you've succeeded, and they become their own best coaches out on the field.
And being an orthopedist, I also want to know how much of the analytics are devoted to keeping players healthy, particularly on the mound, with pitch counts and stuff like that.
I think teams have studied that for a long, long time. I think there's certain things that predispose a pitcher to injury, and some pitchers, with the way they pitch and the way their body is put together, are more predisposed to injury. They just inherently come with a higher injury risk. And that kind of happens at the acquisition stage in the draft, international, pro trades. So to me, you're assessing a lot of that risk ahead of time instead of just dealing with it after the fact. They're putting the forces on their joints, on their elbows, on their shoulders, at certain levels, and different styles of pitching are harder on different types of joints. And so when you have a certain pitcher, he's just predisposed to getting fatigued in a certain area of his body. And, like a submarine pitcher is more likely to have hip or lower back injuries just because they're always bending over when they throw on every pitch. And so if you can design programs to preventively maintain their bodies, but also just recognize that it comes with the territory when you acquire that type of pitcher, I think everybody involved can help support that pitcher to stay as healthy as possible.
So, getting ahead of ourselves to 2022 and hoping that the lockout gets solved really quickly, but you might be in a situation where there's going to be a very shortened spring training. How do you intend to prepare your pitchers in the short amount of time for the next season? How are you going to prevent them from getting injured because of a compressed spring training and so on and so forth?
We almost had a dress rehearsal with the 2020 season in that we had a very quick ramp-up time. This organization, and I give a ton of credit to all the coaches and staff, they stay in touch with all the players. Obviously, right now, you can't talk to the 40-man guys or free agents, but, the minor leaguers, the guys that you can talk to, they are always checking in on them, and the staff has really done an amazing job of making sure they're physically prepared. And prior to the lockout, you kind of had to be in touch with everybody and say, we don't know when we're going to get to talk to you again, but here's your plan. Make sure you stay true to it, and we'll see you on the other side.
Right. Well, anybody who's followed your Twitter knows that you tell a fantastic story, and your Twitter threads are fantastic. And just wanted you to tell us one of them. One of the ones that stuck with me is your most important bullpen session ever, where you're there with Hall of Famer Nolan Ryan. Could you tell us about that incident and how that really impacted you?
Yeah, I was in Hawaii over Christmas, and with the lockout, I was sitting by the pool, and there's no baseball news. And I just jotted down like 20 of my favorite stories, and I started writing them out. And so that was the genesis of the Twitter threads. So if you've seen them recently, I kind of wanted to just give baseball fans something to read that are great memories from my career and my childhood that kind of fill the void, the vacuum of this lockout right now. But that particular story occurred in 1992. My dad was a pitcher for the Texas Rangers. It was the last year of his career, and training was different back then. Once you pitched, the next day you went out on a 5-mile run, and that's what starting pitchers did back then. And so I would jump on my little bike and follow my dad around. But I was always at the stadium. Kids were allowed in the clubhouse. There was gum. There was sunflower seeds. I just loved being at the field. And one day I walked out, and a group of men were at the right field bullpen, and I was curious because they were throwing a football. And I went and sat down and started watching, and, two completely different styles of pitchers. The coach was offering really insightful advice, and I got to watch a couple bullpens that day as an 11-year-old, and it ended up being Kevin Brown and Nolan Ryan and Tom House, the pitching coach. And I learned so much that day, and two totally different styles of pitchers, but it just had a huge impact on me for the rest of my career. And it's one of the reasons I embrace uniqueness in pitching styles, is because Kevin Brown was the polar opposite of Nolan Ryan, but they both had tremendous careers. And so I don't believe that pitchers all have the same mechanics. I really love the uniqueness that a lot of pitchers bring to the table.
I have one more mailbag question, and apologize if you can't answer it because of the lockout, but the question from Michael is, what about Alex Cobb stood out when looking to sign him? And he thinks he can be a real bargain this year in fantasy baseball due to his advanced stats last year.
I won't get into the behind the scenes of that, but, he's done a lot of work with Driveline the last couple of years. He had a tremendous year in Anaheim last year. When you see a pitcher have a really good process and put in a lot of really good work in the off season and is really invested in becoming a better pitcher and educating himself on what he needs to do to be prepared every day, and gets to know his analytics at a very high level, you're impressed. And so just in my initial conversation with him, he's put in a ton of work. And so I'm just excited when the lockout's over to work with him.
Yep, absolutely. And ATC Projections currently projects him for 136 innings, 123 strikeouts, 3.95 ERA, and a 1.31 WHIP with 9 wins this year. So hoping that happens for you guys. Thanks so much again, Brian, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. What have you got going on the next couple of weeks until hopefully we'll start the season going on?
yeah, the minor leaguers and the non-roster guys are already hard at work, like I'm sure they are for teams around baseball. I know everybody's excited to work with the players again, and I'm just a huge fan of the game of baseball, and I want every generation of baseball fans to be able to experience games again. So I'm looking forward to that.
Likewise. All right. Again, that's Brian Bannister. Thank you so much for joining the show. I'm Ariel Cohen here with Ruvain Guy, and we'll see you next time on the Beat the Shift podcast presented by Fangraphs.
Thanks for listening to the Beat the Shift podcast presented by Fangraphs. Follow us on Twitter at beat_shift_pod.